The stagecoach lurched one last time, its wheels sucking at the mud with a sound like a dying gasp. For a moment, there was only the heaving of the horses and the whine of a wind that had no trees to slow it down. Clara pushed aside the stiff leather flap and looked out. This was it. Promise, Wyoming. It was less a town and more a wound on the landscape. A collection of unpainted timber buildings huddled against the vast, empty plain as if for warmth. The main street was a river of thick, brown mire, churned by hooves and wagon wheels until it looked like primordial stew. Weeks of being rattled and jolted across the country had settled deep in her bones, a permanent ache that mingled with the tremor of fear in her stomach. She clutched the handle of her small reticule, the worn fabric a familiar comfort. Inside were 2 letters from Mr. Cyrus Blackwood, his handwriting a confident, looping script that promised a respectable life, a small ranch, and a future free from the suffocating piety of her aunt's house in Ohio. He had advertised for a bride of good character and modest temperament. Clara hoped with every fiber of her being that she could be both. She stepped down onto the offered crate, her boots sinking immediately into the muck. The air was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of wood smoke, wet earth, and something else, the smell of a place where things were stripped down to their barest elements. Survival. That was the scent. A man separated himself from the handful of onlookers leaning against the general store's porch. He was tall, dressed in a black coat that seemed too fine for the mud splattering its hem. His face was handsome in a sharp, narrow way, with a neatly trimmed mustache that failed to soften the calculating glint in his eyes. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze traveling from the scuffed toes of her boots to the plain gray wool of her dress, lingering for a moment on her face, which she knew was pale and smudged with dust from the trail. A flicker of something, disappointment, maybe even disdain, crossed his features before he masked it with a tight smile. "Miss Clara May Thompson?" he asked. His voice was smoother than she'd expected. She nodded, her own voice a dry whisper. "Mr. Blackwood, it is a pleasure to finally meet you." "Cyrus," he corrected, though there was no warmth in it. He did not offer his hand. "The journey was hard on you. I see. You look tired." It was not a statement of concern, but an appraisal. She felt like a head of cattle he was considering for purchase. The hope that had sustained her through the miserable journey began to curdle. "It was very long, sir." "Well, you are here now," he said, turning away as if the matter of her arrival was a chore now completed. "Come, you must be hungry. We will get you a hot meal before we see to the formalities." Clara had imagined a quiet meeting with a justice of the peace, or perhaps a small church with a steeple that reached for the endless sky. Instead, Cyrus led her toward the largest, loudest building on the street, the Gilded Cage Saloon. Music, tinny and strained, leaked from its swinging doors along with shouts and coarse laughter. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her steps faltering. Is this proper?" He glanced back at her, his smile thin as a razor's edge. "This is Wyoming, Miss Thompson. We do things a bit differently here. The preacher is out tending to a fever in the next county, and the justice is busy. We will eat. You will rest a moment, and then we will sort it out. Do not worry your pretty head." He called her pretty, but the way he said it made her feel plain and foolish. Still, what choice did she have? She was 1,000 miles from everything she had ever known, with less than $1 to her name. Her trunk, containing all her worldly possessions, was still strapped to the back of the stagecoach. She was entirely at his mercy. She followed him through the swinging doors. The saloon was a haze of smoke and sweat. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, whiskey, and unwashed men. Every head turned as she entered. A sea of weathered, bearded faces with eyes that stripped her bare. They stared with a raw, hungry curiosity that made her skin crawl. She was a novelty, a strange bird that had landed far from its flock. Cyrus seemed to enjoy the attention. He guided her to a small, rickety table in the corner, his hand resting on the small of her back with a familiarity that felt like a brand. "Sit," he commanded, not asked. "I will get you some broth, and something to calm your nerves." He left her there, a solitary island in a churning ocean of masculinity. She kept her eyes down, focusing on the deep scratches carved into the wooden tabletop, tracing them with her finger as if they were a map that could lead her out of this place. The men's whispers were a low hum at the edge of her hearing. She caught snippets: Blackwood's mail order, and "don't look like much," and a coarse laugh that followed. Each word was a small stone striking her fragile composure. Cyrus returned with a steaming bowl of thin stew and a small glass of amber liquid. "Here, drink this. It will put some color back in your cheeks." She tasted it. It was whiskey, watered down but still potent enough to burn its way down her throat. She ate the stew, though each spoonful felt like swallowing sand. All the while, she felt Cyrus's eyes on her, not with affection or even interest, but with the flat, cold look of a man counting his chips at a poker table. As the evening wore on, the saloon grew louder and rougher. Cyrus drank steadily, his earlier pretense of civility peeling away with each glass. He spoke to her in short, dismissive sentences, asking nothing about her journey or her life, but telling her at length about his plans for his ranch, plans that sounded grander and more hollow with every boast. Finally, he stood up. "I need to speak with Jedediah, the owner. Business. You stay put." He walked to the long bar, leaving her alone again. Clara sat there, nursing the cold dregs of her stew, feeling the weight of her exhaustion and the sharp sting of disillusionment. This was not the new beginning she had prayed for. This was a cage, and the door was closing. The piano player started a new song, a jaunty tune that was horribly out of sync with the despair blooming in her chest. Under the cover of the noise, Cyrus's voice carried from the bar, sharp and clear. He was speaking to a large, bald man who was wiping the bar with a dirty rag. "Look at her. Jed," Cyrus said, and Clara knew with a sickening certainty he was talking about her. "Hardly the prize I was hoping for, plain as a mud fence." The bartender, Jedediah, chuckled. "What did you expect for 50 cents on the word Cyrus, a queen from Europe?" "Still," Cyrus went on, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl that she had to strain to hear. "The deal stands. I wager a month's credit you are wrong. I will have her bedded down before the week is out. No ring required. She is desperate. A woman like that, with no money and no name, will do what she is told." The world stopped. The tinny piano, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, it all faded into a dull roar in her ears. No ring required. The words echoed in the sudden, silent chamber of her heart. He had never intended to marry her. The letters, the promises, the advertisement. It was all a lie, a cruel and elaborate deception to lure a desperate woman into his bed. The stew churned in her stomach, and for a moment, she thought she would be sick right there on the filthy floor. Humiliation washed over her, hot and suffocating. It was followed by a wave of pure, cold terror. She was property, a wager, an object to be used and discarded. She looked at Cyrus, saw him slap the bar in triumph as Jedediah laughed and shook his head. She looked at the faces of the other men, their eyes glazed with drink and casual cruelty. There were no allies here. No one would help her. She had to run. The thought was a spark in the darkness of her panic. It was insane. She had nowhere to go, no money, no coat for the biting cold that she knew was waiting outside. Her trunk was locked away, but staying was not an option. Staying was a kind of death. Moving with a slow, deliberate grace she did not feel. She stood up. Her legs were trembling, but she forced them to hold her. No one seemed to notice. Cyrus was still laughing with the bartender. She turned and walked toward the back of the saloon, where she had seen a man go out for air earlier. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat counting down her seconds to discovery. She pushed open a rough-hewn door and slipped out into the night. The cold hit her like a physical blow. The air was frigid, and a light, wet snow was beginning to fall, turning the mud into a slick, icy slurry. The alley behind the saloon stank of rot and cheap whiskey. She took a breath, then another, trying to calm the panic that threatened to swallow her whole. Which way? She had no idea. She just knew she had to get away from the lights of the saloon, away from the sound of that piano. She picked a direction and began to run. Her sensible boots were no match for the treacherous mud. She slipped and slid, her skirts dragging and heavy with grime. A cry of outrage erupted from the saloon behind her. He had noticed she was gone. "Hey, she is gone! The little thief!" Cyrus's voice raw with fury. The lie came so easily to his lips. Of course he would accuse her of theft. It was the perfect excuse. The saloon doors burst open, spilling yellow light and angry men into the street. "There she is!" a voice shouted. Clara's blood ran cold. She scrambled, half running, half falling, through the darkness. The men were coming after her. She could hear their heavy boots pounding in the mud, their voices raised in a chorus of taunts and jeers. "Get her!" "Nowhere to run, little bride." "Spoiled goods, ain't ya?" The last insult hit her harder than any stone. That is what she was to them. Something ruined. She risked a glance over her shoulder. They were closer now, dark shapes moving through the swirling snow, their faces contorted in a kind of gleeful cruelty. This was sport to them. A hunt. She stumbled, her ankle twisting beneath her. One of her boots was sucked clean off by the greedy mud. She did not stop. She pushed herself up and kept going, 1 foot bare to the freezing ground, the sharp rocks and icy filth cutting into her soul. Sobs tore from her throat, raw and ragged. She was trapped. They were going to catch her, and God only knew what they would do when they did. The end of the street was just ahead. Beyond it lay only darkness and the vast, unforgiving wilderness. It was no escape at all, but she ran toward it anyway. As she reached the edge of the town's meager light, a new figure emerged from the gloom. A man on a tall, dark horse, leading 2 others behind him. He moved at a slow, deliberate walk, and he did not seem a part of the chaos that was chasing her. He was a pillar of stillness in the swirling storm of snow and shouting. As he drew nearer, she saw he was broad-shouldered, wrapped in a heavy sheepskin coat, his hat pulled low against the snow. He pulled his horse to a halt, directly in her path. She skidded to a stop, trapped between the rider and the mob. The men pursuing her slowed, their triumphant calls dying in their throats. They saw him too. There was a shift in the air, a sudden tension. Cyrus pushed his way to the front of the group, his face flushed with anger and drink. "Get out of the way," he snarled at the rider. "This ain't your business. That woman is with me. She tried to rob me." The rider did not answer. He did not even look at Cyrus. His gaze was fixed on Clara, on her torn dress, her bare, bleeding foot, the terror in her eyes. His own eyes were shadowed by the brim of his hat, but she could feel their intensity. He dismounted in one fluid motion, landing softly in the mud. He was taller than Cyrus, and broader. There was a quiet deadliness about him, like a wolf resting, that made the men behind Cyrus shuffle their feet and fall silent. Without a single word, he stepped forward and placed himself between Clara and the mob. The sheer, silent finality of the act was more powerful than any shouted threat. It was a line drawn in the mud. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sounds were the wind and Clara's own ragged breathing. Cyrus, emboldened by the whiskey, took a step forward. "I said, this is not your affair. Elias, she is my property." The man named Elias finally moved his head, just enough to look at Cyrus. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "She does not look like anyone's property to me. She looks scared."
"She is a thief and a runaway,"
Cyrus spat, gesturing wildly. "And we aim to teach her a lesson." No, Elias said. The word was flat. Absolute. Cyrus's face purpled with rage. He reached for the pistol tucked in his belt.
You cannot stop all of us, you bastard.
Elias's hand moved in a blur. One moment it was empty. The next it held a heavy Colt revolver. He did not raise it to fire. He just held it, the barrel pointing at the ground. But the message was unmistakable. The click of the hammer being cocked was unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. The men in the mob froze. They knew that sound. They knew what it meant. They had seen men like Elias before, men who lived by the gun and did not make idle threats. Whatever sport they had hoped for was over. The price had just become too high. While they stood there, paralyzed by the cold steel and the even colder stare of the man holding it, Elias turned his back on them. It was a gesture of supreme confidence, or perhaps supreme contempt. He took 2 long strides to where Clara stood shivering. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word of warning, he bent, slid one strong arm beneath her knees and another around her back, and lifted her as if she weighed nothing at all. She was too shocked to cry out. He carried her to his horse, hoisting her onto the saddle with an almost rough efficiency. He swung up behind her, his large frame a solid wall against her back. He grabbed the reins, and with a kick of his heels, sent the horse lunging forward, away from the town, away from the stunned and silent mob. They rode hard into the growing darkness. The lights of promise, Wyoming, vanished behind them, swallowed by the night and the thickening snow. The wilderness opened up before them, a vast and terrifying expanse of white and shadow. The snowy mountains, which had seemed so distant from the town, now loomed over them, their jagged peaks like teeth against the bruised twilight sky. Clara clung to the saddle horn, the world a dizzying blur. The motion of the horse was powerful and sure beneath them. The man behind her was a silent, solid presence. She could feel the heat of his body through her thin dress, a stark contrast to the freezing air that tore at her face and hands. The shock began to recede, and the full weight of what had happened crashed down upon her. She was riding into a blizzard with a strange man, a violent man who had just faced down a mob with a drawn gun. She had escaped Cyrus, but what had she run to? A sob escaped her, then another. She pressed her face into the horse's coarse mane, and the tears she had been holding back finally came, hot and silent at first, then in great, shuddering waves that shook her entire body. She wept for her shattered hope, for her lost dignity, for the utter, terrifying loneliness that was her only companion. The man, Elias, said nothing. He just kept the horse moving at a steady, ground-eating pace. After a time, she felt him shift behind her. He reached around and draped something heavy and coarse over her shoulders. It was a thick wool blanket, smelling of pine smoke and horse and cold leather. He pulled it tight around her, tucking it under her legs, cocooning her in its rough, solid warmth. Beneath the borrowed blanket, barefoot and broken, Clara trembled on his saddle, the sobs finally quieting into a desolate, exhausted silence as the snowy mountains closed around them. The horse moved like a ghost through the whispering pines, its hooves making no sound in the deep, fresh snow. The world had shrunk to this narrow path, a tunnel through a landscape of white and gray. Clara had stopped shivering, a deeper cold having settled into her marrow, a numbness that was almost a comfort. The man behind her, Elias, was a silent mountain. He did not speak, did not shift, but she could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing against her back. He had guided the horse for what felt like hours, moving with an unnerving certainty through the blinding storm, climbing steadily into the high country where the wind bit with sharper teeth. Just when she thought the ride would never end, that they would simply be swallowed by the blizzard and disappear. A shape emerged from the swirling snow. It was a cabin, low-slung and dark, its logs chinked with pale mud, its roof heavy with a thick blanket of white. It was tucked into a small clearing, protected on three sides by a dense stand of snow-laden pines. Smoke, thin and gray, curled from a stone chimney, a fragile signal of life in the immense, indifferent wilderness. Elias reined the horse to a stop and swung down from the saddle. He stood for a moment, his hand on the horse's flank, his head tilted as if listening to the storm. Then he turned to her. He reached up, and for a terrifying second she flinched, expecting a rough hand. But his touch was impersonal, firm yet careful. As he lifted her down from the saddle, her bare foot touched the snow, and a jolt of searing cold shot up her leg, but he did not give her time to fall. He swept her into his arms again. The thick wool blanket clutched tight around her and carried her the last few yards to the cabin door. He pushed the heavy plank door open with his shoulder and stepped inside. The immediate warmth was a shock, a thick, enveloping sensation that made her dizzy. He set her down gently on her feet just inside the doorway and closed the door, shutting out the howl of the wind. A heavy wooden bar slid into place with a solid, definitive thud. They were locked in. The cabin was a single room, larger than she expected, and bathed in the soft, flickering orange light of a fire that burned low in a large stone hearth. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and something else. The clean, sharp scent of pine. She stood there, dripping melted snow onto the floorboards, clutching the blanket around herself like a shield. It was her only covering now. The remnants of her dress were a sodden, muddy ruin at her feet. She was aware, with a fresh wave of shame, that she was nearly naked beneath the wool. Elias moved past her without a glance. He shed his heavy sheepskin coat, hanging it on a wooden peg by the door. Underneath, he wore a simple wool shirt that stretched across his broad shoulders. He stoked the fire, adding several logs from a neat stack beside the hearth. Flames leapt up, bright and hungry, pushing the shadows into the corners of the room. He did all this with an economy of movement, a quiet purpose that was both calming and intimidating. He seemed to have forgotten her. She remained by the door, shaking, not from the cold anymore, but from a bone-deep tremor of shock and fear. She was in the home of a stranger, a man who had faced down a mob with a gun. What did he want from her? What price would he demand for her rescue? The thoughts were a frantic scramble in her mind, each one more terrifying than the last. Finally, he turned to her. His face, fully seen for the first time in the firelight, was hard and weathered. Lines were carved around his eyes and mouth, the work of sun and wind and things she could not guess at. He was not a handsome man, not like Cyrus had been. His features were too stark, his jaw too square, but his eyes were clear and steady, and they held no hint of the leering curiosity she had seen in the saloon. They simply looked at her, taking in her state with a grave, unreadable expression. "There's a bed," he said, his voice a low rumble. He gestured with his head toward a corner of the cabin where a simple cot was built into the wall, piled with thick furs. "You should sleep." She couldn't move. Her feet felt rooted to the floor. The thought of lying down, of being vulnerable in this place, was impossible. She shook her head, a small, jerky motion. He watched her for a long moment. A flicker of something, not impatience, perhaps understanding, crossed his face. He let out a slow breath. "The floor is cold. At least sit by the fire." He pulled a rough-hewn wooden chair closer to the hearth and then retreated to the far side of the room, giving her a wide berth. He was granting her space. She realized he was letting her choose. Slowly, her legs trembling, she walked to the chair and sat down, pulling the blanket so tight it was difficult to breathe. She stared into the flames, watching the wood pop and hiss, feeling the intense heat on her face and shins while her back remained cold. She heard him moving about the cabin, the soft scuff of his boots on the wood floor. He poured something into a tin cup, and the rich smell of coffee filled the air. He brought the cup over, Not to her, but to a small crate that served as a table beside her chair. He set it down and backed away again without a word. She did not touch the coffee. She did not look at him. She just sat there, rigid with fear, and listened to the storm rage outside. Hours passed. The fire burned down to glowing embers, and the cabin grew cooler. Elias added more logs, his movements slow and deliberate so as not to startle her. He did not try to speak to her again. When she finally chanced to look at him, he was sitting on a low stool near the door, his back against the wall. His long rifle was laid across his lap, his hands resting on the stock. His head was tipped forward slightly, his hat still pulled low. He was asleep, but it was the sleep of a watchdog, poised and ready. He had positioned himself between her and the only exit. He was her protector and her jailer. The thought did not bring her any comfort. Overwhelmed by an exhaustion so profound it felt like drowning, Clara finally slumped in the chair, pulled the blanket over her head, and fell into a dark, dreamless void. She awoke to the smell of frying bacon and the pale, gray light of morning filtering through a single small window. The storm had lessened. The wind was now a low moan instead of a shriek. She was stiff and sore, her neck aching from sleeping in the chair. The blanket was still wrapped around her. Across the room, Elias stood with his back to her, tending a cast-iron skillet on the fire. Fear, sharp and immediate, returned. She was in a strange man's cabin, miles from anywhere, with nothing but a blanket to her name. But the fear was mingled with something else now, a weary curiosity. She slowly got to her feet and looked around the cabin in the clear morning light. It was exactly as he was, Spartan, rough-hewn and impeccably clean. The log walls were bare, with no pictures or decorations. The floorboards were scrubbed and swept, besides the cot, the chair, and the stool. The only furniture was a sturdy table with 2 benches and a set of shelves against one wall. On the shelves were a few tin plates and cups, a small sack of flour, another of beans, and a handful of worn books. A hunting knife and a whetstone lay beside them. Everything had its place. It was the home of a man who lived a solitary, orderly life, a life stripped of all excess. There was no sign that a woman had ever set foot in this place. Elias seemed to sense her movement. He turned from the fire, a plate in his hand. He held it out to her. It contained 2 strips of bacon and a piece of hard, dry bread. "Eat," he said. It was not a request. She took the plate, her hand trembling. She sat at the table and ate, forcing the food down her tight throat. It was the first thing she had eaten since the wretched stew in the saloon, and despite her fear, her body craved the sustenance. He did not join her. He stood by the fire, drinking his coffee, watching the snow fall outside the small window. The silence between them was as thick and heavy as the furs on the cot. When she was finished, she took the plate to a bucket of water by the door and washed it, her movements stiff and awkward under his silent gaze. She did not know what the rules were in this place, what he expected of her. Was she a guest? A prisoner? She had to know. She turned to face him, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. "Why?" she asked, her voice a reedy whisper. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Why what?" "Why did you help me?" He was silent for a long time, so long that she thought he would not answer. He stared out the window at the endless white. "I don't like to see men hunt something that cannot fight back," he said finally, his voice low and flat. "It is not a fair sport." He spoke of her as if she were a rabbit or a deer. The comparison stung, but she could not deny its truth. That is what she had been to them. Prey. She gathered her courage. "Who are you?" He gave a short, humorless laugh. "My name is Elias Thorne. I own this land. That is all you need to know." It was a clear dismissal, a wall erected between them, but she could not stop. The questions were a floodgate breaking inside her. "Why do you live alone, so far from town?" This time, his eyes met hers, and there was a flicker of something cold and hard in their depths. "Some men are better company to themselves." The words were a warning. Do not pry further. But she had one more question, the one that burned at the heart of her fear. What do you think of me?" His gaze traveled over her, from her tangled hair down to the rough blanket that covered her. She felt a hot flush of shame, certain he would say something cruel, that he would see her as Cyrus had, as the men in the mob had, as spoiled goods. But he only looked at her with that same grave, unreadable expression. "I think," he said slowly, "that you have had a long run of bad luck." He turned back to the window, the conversation clearly over. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of a sun they could not see through the thick, gray clouds. The snow fell without end. They were truly trapped, suspended in a world of white and silence. They developed a strange, unspoken routine. Elias would hunt for small game, disappearing for hours into the blizzard and returning covered in snow, a brace of rabbits slung over his shoulder. Clara would keep the fire going, cook the simple meals of roasted meat and hard bread, and tidy the small cabin until there was nothing left to clean. She found her dress, washed and mended, hanging by the fire one morning. The tear was stitched with thick, clumsy thread, and the mud stains would never fully come out, but it was wearable. The act of putting it on, of being clothed again, restored a small piece of her shattered dignity. She found her boot, too, set by the hearth to dry, the leather cleaned and oiled. Small, silent acts of care that confused her more than any words. Elias rarely spoke. He seemed to exist in a world of his own making, a world of deep, brooding silence. But sometimes, when he thought she was not looking, she would catch him staring into the fire, his face etched with a profound and terrible sadness. She learned things about him not from his words, but from the spaces in between. She saw the way his hand would sometimes drift to his side, as if expecting to find a second pistol there. She saw the scars on his knuckles, the way he would go completely still at the sound of a branch snapping outside. He was a man haunted by violence. One evening, as he was cleaning his rifle by the fire, she saw a faint, faded tattoo on his forearm, partially hidden by his sleeve. It was a coiled snake. She had seen a similar mark on a man in a town they had passed through on the stagecoach, a man the driver had pointed out with a mixture of fear and respect. "That there is a regulator," the driver had whispered. "A man who hunts other men for money. A bounty hunter." The realization settled in her stomach like a cold stone. This man, her rescuer, had taken lives for profit. The knowledge terrified her, but it also explained the deep well of sorrow in his eyes. He was shunned. He had said, this was why. A killing gone wrong, perhaps a bounty that had cost him more than just the blood on his hands. The forced intimacy of the small cabin began to wear on her. There was no escaping him, no escaping the memories of what had happened in Promise. They were a constant, churning presence in her mind. One night, the dam of her composure finally broke. She was serving him his meager dinner of rabbit stew when the tin plate slipped from her trembling hands and clattered to the floor, splashing gravy across the clean floorboards. A sob, sharp and violent, tore from her throat, and then another. She could not stop them. She sank to her knees, the humiliation of that night in the saloon rising up to choke her. The laughter, the jeers, the horrible, mocking words, spoiled goods. She buried her face in her hands and wept, the raw, ugly sounds of her grief filling the small cabin. She wept for her foolish dreams, for her shattered pride, for the naive girl who had stepped off that stagecoach believing in promises written on paper. There was no movement from Elias. She expected him to shout at her for her clumsiness, to tell her to be quiet, but he did nothing. He simply sat there, a silent witness to her unraveling. When her sobs finally subsided into shuddering, exhausted gasps, she looked up at him through tear-blurred eyes. He was watching her, his face a mask of stone. Slowly, haltingly, the story poured out of her. She told him everything, about the letters, about her hopes for a new life, about Cyrus's handsome face and cold eyes. She told him about the saloon, the whispers, the ugly wager she had overheard. She told him how it felt to be valued at less than a month's bar credit, to be seen as nothing more than a body to be used. Her voice was hoarse, her words jumbled, but she held nothing back. I thought marriage was supposed to be a sanctuary, she whispered, staring at her hands. A promise. But it was just a business transaction. And I was the goods. I believed him. I feel so stupid, so worthless. Elias listened, his expression never changing. He did not interrupt, did not offer false comfort. He simply listened, giving her the gift of his silent, unwavering attention. When she was finally finished, her voice raw and her spirit empty, a profound silence settled over the cabin, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the moan of the wind. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and the hardness in his eyes seemed to soften for just a moment. He leaned forward slightly, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it over the storm. It's not your fault they wanted to own you. The words were simple, but they struck her with the force of a physical blow. He did not say it was not her fault she was deceived. He did not say it was not her fault she was naive. He went to the very heart of it, to the shame that had been branded on her soul. They wanted to own you. He had named the crime. It was not her failure. It was their sin. Something inside her, a knot of grief and self-loathing that had been clenched tight in her chest for days, began to loosen. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. But it was not a tear of sorrow. It was something else, something she could not name. From that night on, something shifted between them. The silence was still there, but it was different. It was no longer a wall, but a space they shared. They ate their meager meals together at the small table, the scrape of their spoons against the tin plates the only sound. They tended the fire, their hands sometimes brushing as they reached for the same log. Each small, shared act was a thread being woven between them, creating a fragile tapestry of trust in the heart of the storm. The nights were the hardest. The cabin was small, and his presence was a powerful, magnetic force. She would lie on her cot, wrapped in furs, and watch the firelight play over his sleeping form by the door. She watched the rise and fall of his chest, the way his hand never strayed far from the rifle in his lap. He was a dangerous man, a killer, and yet, in his presence, she had slept more soundly than she had in months. She was afraid of him, but she was no longer afraid of what he might do to her. A different kind of fear was beginning to take root, a fear of the strange, unsettling feelings he stirred within her. One night, she could not sleep. The wind had died down, and the silence of the snow-covered world was absolute. The fire had burned low, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. She watched him. His face softened in sleep, and an overwhelming loneliness washed over her. It was more than just being alone. It was a deep, aching need to be seen, to be touched, not with cruelty or possession, but with kindness. She rose from her cot, the furs falling away. She was clad in only a thin cotton shift she had fashioned from a flour sack. The cold floorboards shocked her bare feet. She pulled the thick wool blanket from the chair, the one he had given her on the ride, and wrapped it around herself. Slowly, silently, she walked across the room until she was standing just a few feet from him. He was not asleep. His eyes were open, watching her, glinting in the dim firelight. He did not move, did not speak. Her heart was hammering. Every instinct told her to run back to the safety of her cot, but she was so tired of running, so tired of being afraid. Elias, she whispered, her voice trembling. He remained silent, his gaze steady and intense. She took another step closer, until she was standing directly over him. She clutched the blanket tighter. I am tired, she said, her voice barely audible. I am so tired of being afraid. Their eyes locked. The air in the small cabin grew thick, charged with a sudden, palpable energy. The silence stretched, taut and fragile, in his eyes. She saw a flicker of a fierce, banked hunger, but she also saw a deep and profound hesitation. He was fighting a battle with himself, a battle she could not begin to understand. She stood there, trembling, but not from the cold this time. She had offered him a choice, a question without words, and in the crackling silence of the remote mountain cabin, the whole world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his answer. He did not move. He simply watched her from the shadows, his face an unreadable mask in the dying firelight. The silence in the cabin was a living thing, a vast, fragile bubble that held both of them. Clara's words, "I am so tired of being afraid," hung in the air between them, a confession and a plea. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of her own making. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. For a long moment, she thought he would order her back to her cot, that the wall of his solitude would remain impenetrable. But then, with a slowness that seemed to cost him a great effort, he shifted. He did not rise, but he moved the rifle from his lap and set it carefully against the wall beside him. It was a small gesture, but it changed everything. It was an opening, a laying down of arms. He gestured with his chin toward the floor beside him. "The floor is cold," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Sit by the fire." Relief and a fresh wave of terror washed over her. She obeyed, sinking to the floor a few feet from him, pulling the thick wool blanket tightly around her shoulders. She did not dare look at him, focusing instead on the hypnotic dance of the embers in the hearth. They sat in silence, two lonely souls sharing a small circle of warmth while the world outside was buried in an endless, indifferent winter. That night marked a turning point. The storm, as if sensing the shift inside the small cabin, doubled its fury. For days, the wind howled like a hungry beast, piling snow in great drifts that buried the single window and pressed against the door, sealing them in completely. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the cabin, the fire, and the two of them. Their shared existence became a simple, stripped-down rhythm of survival. He would spend part of the day securing the cabin, checking the roof under its immense load of snow, ensuring the chimney was clear. She would portion out their dwindling food supply, a handful of beans, a strip of dried venison, making each meager meal last as long as possible. They moved around each other in the confined space with a new, unspoken awareness. A brush of hands as he passed her a log for the fire sent a jolt through her. The scent of pine and wood smoke on his clothes became a strange, familiar comfort. They were utterly dependent on each other, for warmth, for food, for the simple reassurance of another human presence against the overwhelming power of the storm. The silence began to thaw. It was Clara who broke it first, her voice soft in the dim, snow-filtered light. She started to speak of her life before, not the shameful end in promise, but the long, quiet beginning. She told him of her childhood in a small, green corner of Ohio, of parents lost too soon to fever, leaving her to the charity of an aunt whose kindness was as thin and sharp as a needle. She spoke of a life spent in the shadows of other people's homes, a life of mending, cleaning, and praying, where she was always a burden, a mouth to feed that did not truly belong. "I saw the advertisement in a church paper," she told him one afternoon, her voice barely a whisper as she stared into the fire. It sounded so respectable. A man with his own land, seeking a wife of good character. I thought it was a way out, a chance to build something of my own, to belong somewhere. I did not imagine. I was so foolish. She fell silent, the shame of her naivety a familiar ache. Elias listened, as he always did, his face impassive, but this time, when she finished, he did not turn away. He kept his eyes on her, his gaze steady. "It is not foolish to want a home," he said quietly. His simple validation was like a key turning in a lock she did not know was there. She found herself speaking more freely, telling him of the small dreams she had packed in her trunk along with her 2 good dresses, the hope of a garden, the idea of children, the simple, desperate wish to be truly needed by someone. A few days later, it was his turn. She was mending a tear in his shirt, her head bent over the rough fabric. When the silence stretched on for so long, it became heavy. She looked up to find him staring at the fire, his hands clenched into fists on his knees, his jaw set like granite. A terrible, raw grief radiated from him. "I had a wife once," he said, the words torn from him, rough and painful. "Her name was Anna." Clara froze, the needle still in her hand. He had never spoken of a past that included anyone but himself. "She was from back east, like you," he continued, his voice low and strained. "But she loved these mountains. She said they made her feel small in a good way, that they made her problems seem small. He paused, swallowing hard. "We were happy here, for a time." He fell silent again, and Clara held her breath, knowing that to press him would be to drive him away forever. She waited. "She was with child," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. The time came sooner than we expected. A storm was blowing in. Not as bad as this one, but bad enough. She said we should go to town, to the doctor. She was scared." He closed his eyes, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "I was proud. I was a fool. I told her we did not need a town doctor. I had delivered calves and foals. I thought I could handle it. I did not want to risk the ride in the snow. I told her she was safe here. With me." The last 2 words were laced with a self-loathing so profound it made Clara's own sorrow seem shallow. "It went wrong," he said, his voice flat and dead. "It went wrong from the start. It was long, and there was so much pain. By the time I knew I had made a mistake, it was too late. The snow was too deep. I could not leave her. She and the boy, they were gone by morning." He opened his eyes and stared at his hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. "I built this cabin for her. I buried her and our son on the ridge behind it. Sometimes I think I have been burying them ever since." He looked up, and his eyes met hers. In them, she saw the truth of his isolation. He was not a hermit by choice. He was a man serving a life sentence for a crime only he could see. He had pushed her away not because he did not want her, but because he believed he was a curse. He believed he destroyed everything he was meant to protect. The confession hung in the air between them, a shared and terrible weight. Clara's heart ached for him, for the lonely grief he had carried for so long. She saw him now not as a dangerous stranger, but as a man as broken and scarred as she was. The next afternoon, the storm lulled for a few hours, and a pale, watery sunlight filtered through the top of the snow-caked window. The reprieve was short-lived, but it brought a fleeting sense of hope. They had eaten the last of the beans that morning, and a gnawing hunger had settled deep in Clara's belly. She stood up from the table too quickly, a wave of dizziness washing over her. The room tilted, the firelight splintering into 1,000 tiny stars. She swayed, her knees buckling. Strong arms caught her before she could fall. Elias was there, his hands gripping her waist, holding her steady. His touch was electric. Through the thin wool of her dress, she could feel the heat and strength of his hands, the solid, unyielding power in him. They both froze. Her head was resting against his chest, and she could hear the heavy, slow beat of his heart. It was the most intimate sound she had ever heard. He was so close, she could smell the cold, clean scent of the outdoors that always clung to him. She lifted her head and looked up at him. His face was inches from hers, his expression a mixture of shock and something else, something deeper and more intense that made her breath catch in her throat. The air crackled, The world narrowed to the space between their bodies, to the feel of his hands on her waist, to the storm that was gathering not outside, but within the four walls of the cabin. Then, as quickly as he had caught her, he let her go. He stepped back as if he had been burned, his hands dropping to his sides. He turned away from her, his broad back a rigid wall. "You need to eat," he muttered, his voice rougher than usual. "I will check the traps." He grabbed his coat and was gone, leaving her standing in the middle of the room, her body still humming from his touch, her heart racing with a terrifying, exhilarating new awareness. That night, sleep was impossible. She lay on her cot, staring into the darkness, reliving that moment over and over. She could still feel the imprint of his hands on her waist. She was no longer afraid of him. She was no longer afraid of the town, or of Cyrus, or of the future. The only thing she was afraid of now was the crushing loneliness that awaited her when the snow melted and he sent her away. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that he would send her away. He would do it to protect her from himself. She could not let that happen. She could not bear another rejection, another person deciding what was best for her and leaving her unwanted. For the first time in her life, she was going to choose. She rose from the cot, her movements silent in the sleeping cabin, as she had once before. She pulled the thick wool blanket from the chair and wrapped it around her thin shift. She walked to the hearth, where he sat on his stool, his back to the door, keeping his endless vigil. He was not asleep. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he stared into the glowing embers as if seeking an answer in the flames. She sat on the floor beside him, close enough that her blanket brushed against his leg. He did not look at her, but she saw his hands tighten on his knees.
"Elias,"
she whispered into the quiet. He remained silent, his profile a hard, stark silhouette against the firelight. She took a deep breath, her voice trembling but clear.
"You do not have to stop me if I ask you to stay."
The words were a quiet offering, a terrifying leap of faith. She saw him flinch, a barely perceptible movement. He turned his head and looked down at her, and his eyes were filled with a terrible, warring agony.
"Clara,"
he said, his voice raw, "you do not know what you are asking. You are vulnerable. You are alone and scared. In the morning, you will regret it."
"No,"
she said, her gaze unwavering.
"The only thing I will regret is being sent away. The only thing I am afraid of is being left to feel unwanted again. Please," she begged,
and she heard the desperation in her own voice, the ragged edge of a heart that had been broken too many times. "Do not do that to me. Do not make that choice for me." Her plea seemed to strike him with a physical force. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she saw the walls of his resolve begin to crumble. He saw not a victim, but a woman who was offering him a trust he did not believe he deserved. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, he raised a hand. His fingers were calloused and rough, but his touch was incredibly gentle as he brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. He leaned down, and the kiss, when it came, was not one of passion, but of a slow, heartbreaking tenderness. It was a kiss full of sorrow and loneliness, a hesitant question and a desperate answer. It was the saddest, most beautiful thing she had ever felt. When he pulled back, their eyes met, and in that shared gaze, a lifetime of unspoken pain was acknowledged. With a single, deliberate movement, she let the blanket fall from her shoulders, letting it pool at her waist. It was an act of complete and total surrender, not to him, but to this moment, to the choice she had made. He drew in a sharp breath. For a second, she saw the fierce hunger in his eyes, but it was quickly tempered by something else, something deeper. He did not reach for her with greed. Instead, he opened his arms, and when he wrapped them around her, it was not an act of possession, but of protection. He pulled her close, his large body shielding her, his arms a sanctuary. He buried his face in her hair, and she felt a shudder run through him, a tremor of a man letting go of a grief he had carried for too long. Their night together was not a whirlwind of passion. It was something quieter, more profound. It was emotionally intense, a desperate, tender exploration of two broken people trying to find the pieces of themselves in each other. It was in the way his rough hands traced the line of her spine, as if memorizing a map of a forgotten land. It was in the way she held on to his shoulders, anchoring herself to his strength. It was a silent conversation held in the language of touch, a mending of fractures, a desperate plea for wholeness in the heart of the storm. For him, it was an act of redemption. For her, it was an act of reclamation. Sometime in the deep, silent hours before dawn, she fell asleep, not on her cot, but in his arms. The fire had burned down to a soft, rosy glow, and the wind outside had finally fallen silent. She was curled against his side, his arm a heavy, comforting weight around her, his steady breathing a lullaby against her ear. When she woke, pale morning light was filtering through the snow on the window. She was still wrapped in his embrace, her head resting on his chest. She lay there, silent but peaceful, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of his heart. For the first time since she had stepped off that stagecoach in promise, for the first time in a long, long time. She had slept without fear. The first sound was the drip of water, a slow, steady rhythm that was not the crackle of fire or the howl of wind. Clara opened her eyes to a world that had changed. The oppressive gloom of the cabin had been replaced by a soft, clear light. The snow that had blinded the small window had slumped away, allowing the pale gold of morning to spill across the floorboards. The thaw had begun. She was still tangled in the furs of the cot. Alone, the cabin was warm, the fire stoked high, and the smell of fresh coffee hung in the air. Elias was standing by the open door, a silhouette against the brilliant, painful white of the snow-covered world. He was looking out, but his posture was tense, his shoulders rigid. He was not admiring the morning. He was watching the horizon, a sentinel on guard. A fragile, tender awkwardness settled between them. The raw intimacy of the night before had left them both exposed, stripped of their armor of solitude and mistrust. When he turned and saw she was awake, he could not quite meet her eyes. He poured her a cup of coffee and set it on the table, his movements too deliberate, too controlled. She dressed behind the thin partition of a blanket she had hung, her fingers fumbling with the buttons on her worn dress. When she emerged, he was sitting at the table, staring into his cup as if it held the answers to a difficult question. The silence was different now. It was not empty. It was full of unspoken things, of a future that had suddenly, terrifyingly, appeared before them.
"The snow is melting,"
she said, her voice soft. He nodded, not looking up. The pass might be clear in a few days. A few days. The words were like a death sentence. A few days, and he would take her back down the mountain. A few days, and this strange, intense world they had built in the heart of the storm would dissolve like a dream.
"I do not want to go,"
she said, the words coming out in a rush before her courage could fail. He looked up then, and the agony was back in his eyes, sharper than before.
"Clara, this is no life for you. This cabin, this loneliness. You deserve a town, a home with neighbors, a garden with soil that is not half rock.
You deserve more."
"What if this is what I choose?"
she challenged, her voice gaining strength. "You told me it was not my fault that they wanted to own me. Are you not doing the same thing, deciding what I deserve, what I should want?" He flinched as if she had struck him. "That is not the same. I am trying to protect you."
"Protect me from what?"
she cried, her frustration mounting. "From a life of hardship? I have never known anything but hardship. Or are you trying to protect me from you?" He had no answer. He just stared at her, his face a grim, stony mask. The argument, the first of their new and fragile connection, was left hanging between them, unresolved. He pushed himself away from the table and went outside to check his traps. a retreat into the familiar silence of the wilderness. 2 days passed in a state of tense, unspoken conflict. The snow continued to melt, slumping from the pine branches in heavy clumps, revealing the dark, wet earth beneath. The world was waking up, and with it, the threat of what lay beyond their mountain sanctuary. They spoke only when necessary, their conversations clipped and practical, but the awareness between them was a constant, humming current. At night, he slept by the door again, the rifle once more across his lap. She lay awake on her cot, the memory of his arms around her a phantom ache. On the 3rd day, a man appeared. He came out of the woods on a pair of snowshoes, a pack of furs on his back, his face a mask of wind-burned leather and grizzled beard. He hailed the cabin with a gruff shout, and Elias went still, his hand instinctively going to the pistol tucked in his belt. He stepped outside, positioning himself in front of the door, a silent barrier. Clara watched through a crack in the door. The man was a trapper, his clothes a patchwork of deer and rabbit skin. He stopped a few yards from Elias. His eyes narrowed. "Thorn," the trapper grunted, his voice like gravel. "By God, I figured you were dead or in Mexico by now." "Still here, Jedediah," Elias replied, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. The trapper, Jedediah, spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the snow. His gaze flickered past Elias to the cabin, and his eyes widened slightly as he caught a glimpse of Clara. A slow, knowing grin spread across his face. "Well, now, I see you have found yourself some company. Explains a few things." "State your business," Elias said, his voice dangerously low. "Just passing through, heading down to promise to trade my plues," the trapper said. He shifted his pack. "Thought I would warn you, though it seems you already know you are in trouble. That town is buzzing like a kicked beehive, talking about you." Clara's blood ran cold. "They are saying you rode in and snatched Cyrus Blackwood's mail-order bride right out from under him," Jedediah continued, clearly enjoying the drama. "Blackwood is telling everyone you kidnapped her, that she is a crazed, hysterical woman you have taken against her will. He has worked the whole town into a lather. They have put out a bounty on your head. Thorn, $500 for the man who brings you in, and the woman back." $500. The sum was staggering. It was enough to make a man risk facing even Elias Thorn. The world tilted on its axis. This was not just a misunderstanding. This was a lie that had been bought and paid for, a lie that would get Elias killed. Elias's face was stone, but Clara saw the muscle jump in his jaw. "Is that so?" he said. It was not a question. "Just thought you should know," the trapper said, backing away slowly. "I ain't getting in the middle of it, but others will. That is a lot of money." He gave Elias a final, grim nod, turned, and disappeared back into the trees as silently as he had come. Elias stood there for a long moment, staring at the spot where the trapper had been. Then he turned and came back inside, barring the door behind him. The look on his face was terrible. It was the look of a man seeing a trap he had long expected finally spring shut. Clara's fear was instantly consumed by a white-hot rage. "Kidnapping?" she seethed, her voice shaking. "He dares to call it that after what he did? After what they all did?" She paced the small cabin like a caged animal. "We have to go back. We have to go to the town and tell them the truth. I will tell them. I will stand up in front of all of them and tell them what Cyrus Blackwood is." "No," Elias said. The word was a stone wall. "What do you mean? No," she demanded, whirling to face him. "They will hang you for this. We cannot let them believe this lie." "They will hang me no matter what," he said, his voice flat and devoid of hope. "My word against the whole town's. A mob with a rope does not ask for testimony. Clara, they are not interested in the truth. They are interested in a hanging, and I will not let you stand in front of those men again." The finality in his voice was like a slap. Suddenly, all her fury, all her righteous indignation, curdled into a familiar, sickening feeling of rejection. He was not protecting her. He was dismissing her. He was pushing her away again, making decisions for her. Just as Cyrus had. Just as her aunt had. Just as everyone had her entire life.
"So that is it?"
She whispered, her voice cracking with a pain that was sharper than any fear. "You will just hide up here until they come for you? What about me? What happens to me then? Or was last night, was that just for a night, a moment of comfort before you throw me away?" The accusation hit him hard. She saw it in the sudden anguish that flashed in his eyes. He was torn, ripped apart by his guilt and his shame, and a feeling for her that he did not know how to name, but he could not speak it. The habit of solitude was too strong. The belief in his own damnation was too deep. He reverted to the only thing he knew, pushing people away for their own good. "You will be better off without me," he said, his voice rough. "I bring nothing but trouble and death. I told you that. You should have stayed away from me." The words, meant to protect her, were the cruelest he could have chosen. They confirmed her deepest fear. She was a mistake, unwanted, a burden. A wave of suffocating despair washed over her. She could not breathe in this cabin, could not breathe in the same space as this man who had saved her only to break her heart. She turned and ran. She unbarred the door and fled out into the snow, into the woods, driven by a blind, desperate need to escape. She did not know where she was going. She just ran, the cold air searing her lungs, the melting snow soaking her thin dress and cheap boots. "Clara!" His voice, raw with alarm, echoed behind her. She did not stop. She plunged deeper into the trees, branches whipping at her face. The ground was a treacherous mix of deep snow and slick, freezing mud. She stumbled, her foot catching on a hidden root, and she went down hard. One of her boots, the one he had so carefully cleaned and oiled for her, was ripped from her foot and swallowed by the slush. She did not even try to retrieve it. She scrambled up and kept going, just as she had that night in promise, one foot bare to the biting cold. Sobs tore from her throat, hot and agonizing. She was running in circles, fleeing one man only to be rejected by another, trapped in a nightmare of her own making. She reached a creek, its waters still mostly locked under a thick plate of ice, and she could go no further. Her strength gave out. She collapsed onto the snowy bank, hugging her knees to her chest, and wept with the kind of abandon that comes only from absolute despair. She did not hear him approach. She only knew he was there when a large, dark shape knelt in the snow beside her. She did not look up, but she could feel his presence, the heat and stillness of him. He did not touch her. He just knelt there, a silent witness to her pain, just as he had been when she had first broken down in his cabin. Minutes passed. Her sobs slowly subsided into ragged, hitching breaths. The cold from the snow began to seep into her bones. "Clear," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "I was wrong." She finally looked at him. His face was a mask of torment. He was not looking at her, but at his own hands, spread open on his knees as if they were foreign objects he did not recognize. He took a ragged breath. "When Anna died," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "I did not just lose her. I lost the part of me that knew how to build things, the part of me that knew how to give. All I have known since is how to take. I have tracked men. I have hunted them. I have taken life." He finally lifted his head, and his eyes, raw with unshed tears, met hers. "I have taken life," he repeated, his voice breaking. "I do not know how to give it back." The confession was the most honest, vulnerable thing he had ever said. It was the heart of his pain, the source of the poison that had convinced him he was a curse. He did not know how to nurture, how to love, how to accept a gift as fragile and precious as the one she had offered him. He only knew how to destroy. Her anger, her pain, it all melted away, replaced by a wave of profound, aching compassion. He was not rejecting her. He was terrified. She reached out a trembling hand and laid it on his. His skin was cold, but he did not pull away. He looked down at their joined hands, his large, scarred one and her small, pale one, resting together in the snow. "Then give me a choice," she whispered. "That is all I have ever wanted. Do not decide for me. Do not leave me without saying goodbye. Let me choose, stay or go, but let it be my choice." He looked at her for a long time, his gaze searching her face. He saw no pity there, only a fierce, steady strength that matched his own. He had met his equal in this quiet woman from Ohio. He had tried to push her away to save her, and she had simply refused to be saved. She had demanded to stand beside him instead. Slowly, he nodded. He squeezed her hand, a brief, firm pressure that was a promise. Then he stood and gently pulled her to her feet. He looked down at her bare, muddy foot, and without a word, he bent and lifted her into his arms. He carried her back through the woods, his steps sure and steady. They returned to the cabin together, still unsure, still afraid, the threat of the bounty hanging over them like a guillotine. But they were not alone anymore. They were no longer fighting each other. They were facing the world together. That night, after a silent meal, she did not go to her cot. She went to him, where he sat by the fire, and sat beside him. He looked at her, and this time there was no hesitation. He opened his arms and drew her in, pulling the thick wool blanket around both of them. They did not speak. There was nothing left to say. They lay beside each other by the dying embers of the fire. This time, it was slower. It was not the desperate, frantic collision of two lonely souls in a storm. It was a quiet covenant, a tenderness that spoke more than their bodies ever could. It was his hand gently tracing the curve of her cheek, and her fingers tangling in his hair. It was a promise made in silence, not of a future, but of a present. A promise to face the morning, whatever it might bring, together. It was not a fire, but a hearth, a small, warm place in a cold and dangerous world. The thaw came not as a gentle promise, but as a messy, weeping surrender. The world, which had been clean and white and silent, was now a landscape of dripping trees, sodden earth, and the constant gurgle of unseen water. The path down the mountain would soon be clear. The future, which had been held at bay by the storm, was now at their door, demanding an answer. Clara gave her answer not in words, but in actions. She did not speak of leaving or staying. Instead, one morning, she took a rusty spade she had found in the small lean-to and began to turn over a small patch of earth on the sunny side of the cabin. The ground was rocky and hard, and the work was back-breaking. Elias watched her from the doorway, his face a mixture of confusion and a deep, aching tenderness. She was not digging a hole, she was planting a root. "The soil is poor here," he said, his voice quiet. "It is my own," she replied without looking up, her hands deep in the dark, cold earth. She decided to stay. It was a decision made not in a moment of passion, but in the slow, deliberate rhythm of her days. She was not staying as a hidden lover, a secret kept in a mountain cabin. She would be his equal, or she would be nothing at all. She began to mend the cabin, chinking the logs with fresh mud and moss, patching the worn furs with a bone needle and thread. She was not just a guest seeking shelter. She was a woman building a home. Her most audacious act came one afternoon when Elias was out hunting. She took out the last of her precious paper and the stub of a pencil she had guarded in her reticule. For hours, she sat at the rough-hewn table, her brow furrowed in concentration, and wrote a letter. She addressed it to the preacher. Promise, Wyoming Territory. She did not know if the old, complicit preacher had returned, or if the town had a new one. As the trapper had hinted, it was a shot in the dark, a prayer sent out into the wilderness. In the letter, she did not write as a victim. She wrote as Clara May Thompson, a woman of sound mind and strong will. She told the truth, simply and without embellishment, of the contract with Cyrus Blackwood,
of his deceit, of the wager, and of the mob. She wrote of Elias Thorne, not as a kidnapper, but as a man who had offered her sanctuary when no one else had offered her decency. She did not ask for pity. She asked for justice. She sealed the letter and hid it, waiting for a chance, any chance, to send it. Elias, for his part, was undergoing his own quiet transformation. The guilt that had been his constant companion for years was still there, but it was no longer a solitary burden. By letting her in, he had allowed a sliver of light into the dark room of his past. He had made a promise to give her a choice, and he intended to honor it. If she chose to stay, she would not be a helpless creature hiding behind his gun. She would be a woman of the mountains. He began to teach her. He started with the horses, showing her how to saddle and bridle them, how to speak to them in a low, calm voice that they would understand. He led her on short rides through the muddy, awakening forest, his hand steady on her rein at first, then letting go, allowing her to find her own balance, her own confidence. She learned the rhythm of the horse beneath her, the feeling of freedom as they moved through the whispering pines. Then, one grim, overcast afternoon, he brought out his spare pistol. It was heavy and cold in her hands, an object of pure, deadly function. She wanted to drop it. The memory of the gun in Cyrus's hand, of the mob's lust for violence, was still a raw wound. "I do not want to," she whispered, her hands trembling. "I know," Elias said, his voice gentle. "That is why you must learn. Fear is a weapon they will use against you. You must have a weapon of your own." He stood behind her, his large frame a shield against the wind. His hands covered hers, showing her how to hold the gun, how to distribute its weight. He smelled of leather and snow and safety. "Do not think of the man," he murmured in her ear, his breath warm. "Think of the target, just the target. Squeeze, do not pull." Her first shot went wide, the explosion deafening, the recoil jarring her to the bone, but she did not drop the gun. She took a deep breath, the sharp scent of gunpowder filling her lungs. And she tried again, and again. Over the next few days, he taught her to load, to aim, to clean the weapon until its maintenance was a familiar ritual. She learned to control her breathing, to steady her hands, to make the cold, heavy object an extension of her will. She hoped, with every fiber of her being, that she would never have to use it. But the knowledge that she could, that she was no longer defenseless, was a powerful, transformative thing. He was not just teaching her to shoot. He was teaching her to claim her own life, to stand on this rugged piece of land as his equal. They had settled into a fragile peace, a quiet rhythm of shared work and growing trust. They knew the threat of the bounty was out there, a storm gathering on the horizon, but in the small, protected world of the cabin, they allowed themselves a sliver of hope. But the past is a hungry wolf. It always finds a way back. It happened at dusk. They were riding back from checking a line of traps, a string of rabbits tied to Elias's saddle. The air was cool and damp, and the first stars were beginning to prick the deep purple sky. As they approached the clearing, Elias suddenly reined in his horse, his body going rigid. "What is it?" Clara whispered. "Smoke," he said, his voice a low growl. "Too much smoke, and light." He dismounted, pulling his rifle from its scabbard. "Stay here, and stay quiet." He moved into the trees, melting into the shadows with the deadly grace of a panther. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She slid from her horse, her hand going to the pistol tucked into the waistband of her dress. Her hands were not trembling. They were steady. A shout ripped through the quiet evening, followed by a cruel laugh that she recognized with a sickening jolt. Cyrus Blackwood. "Come on out, Thorne." Cyrus's voice was slick with malice. "We know you are in there. We know you have got my property with you. Send her out, and we might let you live." Flames suddenly erupted in the clearing. They had torches. 3 figures were visible, their faces demonic in the flickering light. Cyrus and 2 other men, hulking brutes with rifles in their hands.
A shot exploded from the trees where Elias was hidden. One of the men grunted and dropped his torch, but he was not hit. Elias was buying time, trying to draw their fire. "He is in the trees!" one of the thugs yelled. They turned, firing blindly into the darkness. Clara knew she had to move. Elias was pinned down. She crept through the woods, circling around the clearing, her feet making no sound on the damp pine needles. The lessons Elias had taught her came back in a clear, cold rush. Use the darkness. Stay low. Control your breathing. She saw a flash from Elias's rifle again, and in that same instant, one of the thugs fired back. A spray of bark exploded from the tree right next to Elias's head. He was nearly shot. He ducked back, unable to get a clear shot without exposing himself. This was her chance. Cyrus and one of the men were focused on the trees where Elias was hidden. The other man was reloading, his back partially to her. He was the target, just the target. She raised the pistol with both hands, just as Elias had shown her. The world narrowed to the V of the gun sight. She did not think, she acted, she squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked in her hands, the sound a deafening roar in her ears. The man screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and pain, and dropped his rifle, clutching his shoulder where the bullet had torn through flesh. The surprise was total. Cyrus and the other thugs spun around, their faces a mask of disbelief. In that split second of confusion, Elias exploded from the trees. He moved with a terrifying speed, a silent, deadly force. He slammed into the remaining gunmen, a brutal collision of bodies. The man's rifle went flying. Elias drove a fist into his jaw, and the man crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Cyrus stood frozen, his handsome face pale and slack with terror. He was alone, facing a furious Elias and a woman holding a smoking pistol. The predator had become the prey. Elias advanced on him, his face a grim mask of cold fury. He picked up the fallen rifle and leveled it at Cyrus's chest. "Get off my land," Elias snarled, his voice a low, deadly rumble. Cyrus scrambled backward, his bravado gone, replaced by a desperate, craven fear. "This is not over, Thorn," he spat, his voice trembling. "The town will never let you live in peace. You will always be looking over your shoulder. You will never be safe." He turned and fled, crashing into the darkness, the wounded man stumbling after him. They left their unconscious companion on the ground, a testament to their failed ambush. Silence descended on the clearing, broken only by the crackle of the dropped torch and the ragged sound of their breathing. Elias stood over the unconscious man, his rifle still raised, his whole body humming with the violence of the fight. Clara lowered the pistol, her arm suddenly feeling as heavy as lead. The smell of gunpowder was thick in the air. She had shot a man. She had not killed him. She could see that, but she had shot him. She felt no remorse. She felt no fear. She felt a cold, clear certainty that she had done what she had to do. Elias finally turned to her. He looked at her, at the pistol still in her hand, at her steady gaze, and something in his expression shifted, the last wall between them, the one that had separated the protector from the protected, crumbled into dust. He saw her, truly saw her, as his equal. They tied up the unconscious man and left him by the trail for the trapper or someone else to find. They knew Cyrus would not be back, not soon, but his threat hung in the air, a poison that tainted their victory. The town will never let them live in peace. They spent that night in a state of raw, heightened awareness. They did not speak of the fight. They did not need to. They tended to the small scrape on Elias's temple from the exploding bark, their hands brushing, their movements slow and deliberate. They knew this could be their last night of peace, their last night together. The world was coming for them, and they might not survive it. Later, by the low light of the fire, they came together with a quiet, desperate intensity. It was a shedding of all pretense, a raw communion of two souls bracing for the end. It was bare skin and raw emotion, a silent language of touch that said everything words could not. They held each other as if trying to memorize the feel of a dream before waking. In the deepest, most silent hour of the night, as she lay wrapped in his arms, her head on his chest, she asked the question that haunted her. It was not about tomorrow's fight, or the bounty, or the town. It was simpler and far more important. "Will you still hold me tomorrow?" she whispered into the darkness. She felt his chest rise and fall in a slow breath. He tightened his arm around her, pulling her impossibly closer, until they seemed to breathe with the same lungs. "Every day I have left," he replied, his voice a rough, unbreakable vow in the quiet of the room. They did not wait for the bounty hunters to come to them. They did not wait for the world to pass its judgment. At dawn on the fourth day, when the sun rose weak and hazy over the misty peaks, they rode down from the mountain. They rode together, side by side, on the two horses Elias had kept in his lean-to. They moved not with the furtive haste of fugitives, but with the slow, deliberate purpose of settlers coming to claim their ground. They were husband and wife in spirit, if not in law, a truth that was as solid and real as the mountain at their backs. As they neared promise, the familiar sights and smells of the town returned, the tang of wood smoke, the stench of the tannery, the thick, cloying mud of the main street. Doors opened. Faces appeared in windows. The town that had hunted Clara for sport now fell silent, watching the approach of the feared recluse and the woman he had stolen. Whispers followed them like a foul wind, but no one stood in their way. They rode directly to the center of the town, stopping in the open space between the general store and the Gilded Cage saloon. It was the very spot where the mob had cornered her. This time, there was no mob. There was just a loose collection of curious, wary townspeople, drawn from their daily chores by the audacity of their arrival. Cyrus Blackwood stepped out onto the saloon porch, a glass of whiskey in his hand. A smirk played on his lips. He had been expecting them, but not like this. He expected a man dragged in with ropes, a woman weeping and hysterical. He did not expect this quiet, unbreakable solidarity. Elias swung down from his horse, his rifle held loosely in one hand, not as a threat, but as a simple fact of his existence. He turned and offered his hand to Clara. She took it, and he helped her dismount. She did not hide behind him. She stood beside him, her back straight, her chin high. Her dress was worn and patched, but she wore it like a queen's robes. Her gaze swept over the crowd, missing nothing, and finally came to rest on Cyrus. It was Clara who spoke first. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear and steady, and it carried in the tense silence. "My name is Clara May Thompson," she began, her eyes locked on Cyrus. "I came to this town under contract to be the wife of that man, Cyrus Blackwood." She pointed a single unwavering finger at him. The crowd murmured. "I came in good faith, believing in the promises he made me in his letters, but those promises were a lie." Her voice did not tremble. "When I arrived, he did not take me to a justice or a preacher. He brought me to that saloon, and he left me at a table while he made a wager with the owner. He wagered that he could have me in his bed within a week, with no ring required. He never had any intention of marrying me." A gasp went through the crowd. Several of the men who had been part of the mob shuffled their feet, refusing to meet her eyes. Cyrus's smirk faltered, his face flushing with anger. "That is a lie," he shouted from the porch. "She is a crazed, hysterical woman. She robbed me and fled. This man, this killer, has filled her head with fantasies." Clara did not even look at her accuser. She kept her address to the town. "I heard the wager with my own ears, and when I fled for my dignity and my safety, he turned you." She swept her gaze over the faces of the men. "Into a hunting party. You called me spoiled goods. You chased a terrified, unarmed woman through the mud for your own amusement. Is that the law in this town? Is that the kind of men you are?" The silence that followed was thick with shame. She had not accused them of a crime.
She had accused them of a failure of character, a far deeper wound. Now, Elias stepped forward, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. "I took her from this town," he admitted, his gaze hard and challenging. "I harbored her in my cabin. That much is true." He paused, letting the weight of his confession settle. "But she did not come with me against her will. I offered her shelter when you offered her scorn." He took a step toward the saloon porch, his eyes boring into the men who had once been the mob. "Look at her," he commanded. "Look at her now. I ask any one of you to stand up and say she was better off without me. I ask you to say she would have been better off in the hands of a man who would put a price on her honor in a saloon. Is there any man here who will say that?" No one moved. No one spoke. The bounty of $500 seemed a paltry sum now, measured against the raw, unshakable truth of what stood before them. The town's certainty, so solid and self-righteous just days before, had crumbled into dust. Into this fractured silence, a new voice spoke. "The woman is right to ask, what kind of men are we?" A man stepped out from the crowd. He was young, dressed in the simple black coat of a preacher, his face tired but his eyes clear and firm. This was the new preacher, the one who had been away tending the sick. He walked to the center of the street and stood near Clara and Elias, facing the townspeople. "I have been in this town only a short time," he said, his voice ringing with a quiet authority. "And in that time, I have heard whispers of this affair. I heard of a woman shamed and a mob raised. I heard of a bounty, but I heard nothing of justice." He turned his gaze on Cyrus, who seemed to shrink under the weight of it. "The Bible speaks against bearing false witness, Mr. Blackwood. It speaks against the sin of pride and of preying upon the vulnerable who come to you for protection." Then he looked at the rest of the town. "And it speaks against the wickedness of a mob. You were not upholding the law that night. You were indulging in a spectacle of cruelty. This woman," he said, gesturing to Clara, "and this man," he nodded to Elias, "did not come here today as criminals. They came here as brave souls demanding that this community look at itself in the mirror, and the reflection is not a pleasant one." The town's mood, which had been hostile, then shamed, now shifted into something else, a grudging, nascent respect. They had been wrong, and they knew it. Justice in the West was often a swift and brutal affair. There was no trial. The preacher's words, combined with Clara's unshakable testimony, were the only verdict needed. That afternoon, Cyrus Blackwood was escorted to the edge of town by 3 of the very men who had once been his mob and was told never to return. His lies had bought him nothing but exile. That evening, as the sun set, the preacher approached Elias and Clara. "What you did today took a great deal of courage," he said. "This town, it has a hard crust, but it is not rotten to the core. It needs good, strong people to help it find its way. We would be honored if you would consider staying, not as outcasts, but as neighbors." The seasons turned. The last of the snow melted from the high peaks, and the mountain bloomed with the fierce, fragile beauty of a Wyoming spring. The cabin, once a Spartan shelter, a place of survival and sorrow, became a home. Clara's small garden, carved from the rocky soil, took root. Against all odds, she coaxed green shoots of beans and squash from the earth. The work was hard, her hands often raw and her back aching. But every green leaf was a victory, a testament to her will. One day, Elias came home from a trip to town with a scruffy, one-eyed dog that had been tied up and left for dead. They named him Patches. He became a fixture on the cabin porch, a loyal, thumping tail and a warm body at the foot of their cot at night. Clara's ink-stained hands became a common sight. Word of her literacy and her courage had spread through the territory. Women from remote homesteads, other mail-order brides full of hope and fear, began to seek her out. She would sit with them at the rough-hewn table, their heads bent together, and she would write letters for them, letters of love, letters of complaint, letters demanding the respect and dignity they deserved. She had found her purpose, not as a wife in the traditional sense, but as a voice for the silent. Elias, once the feared and shunned bounty hunter, found a new kind of peace. The townspeople, led by the preacher, began to treat him not with fear, but with a quiet respect. They sought his knowledge of the mountains, his skill as a hunter, his unflinching honesty. The ghosts of his past had not vanished, but they no longer held dominion over him. He had learned to give life back, not by creating it, but by nurturing the life that had so bravely chosen to stand beside him. For the first time in years, he slept soundly through the night, every night, with Clara's warmth wrapped against him, a human anchor in the quiet dark. One late autumn afternoon, the sky turned a familiar shade of pearl gray. A chill entered the air, carrying the scent of winter. Clara stood at the open cabin door, a thick wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the horizon. Patches sat at her feet, his head resting on her boots. Her garden was put to bed for the winter, its bounty stored in the cellar Elias had dug for her. A single, perfect snowflake drifted down and melted on her cheek. Then another, and another. The snow had begun to fall again. It was no longer a threat. It was not a prison. It was a promise of quiet days, of warmth and firelight, of a world made clean and new. She heard his footsteps behind her. Elias came and stood beside her, his solid presence a familiar comfort. He said nothing, simply watching the snow with her. Then he took off his heavy sheepskin coat, the one that smelled of pine and winter, and draped it over her shoulders, over the blanket she already wore. He pulled it close, his arms encircling her in its warmth. She leaned back against his chest, her head resting on his shoulder. "Let's go back inside, wife," he whispered. "Thank you for joining us on this journey through the heart of the American frontier. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow enthusiasts of the Old West. And please consider subscribing to the From Wild West channel and sharing your thoughts in English.